Hey, editing Tyler here. I just wanted to say, after recording this episode, I remembered that my great grandmother actually used to quilt. And the history of the family goes all the way back. I mean, great grandpa was World War I vet. They were, out there picking cotton and all that other stuff and dragging my grandfather along in his diaper and this and that. And so I remembered this and I was like, I gotta go check. And sure as heck, she made quilts out of feed sack fabric as well as my grandfather clarifying that he too wore shirts that she would make out of those same feed sacks. So pretty cool. And there's a quilt up there that's just like a bunch of little scraps of the feed sack stuff, and I'll include those photos here so that you can see that. And I just thought that was a cool thing to bring up and introduce something that also my family took a part in, because way back then they were poor as heck. No power, no indoor plumbing, all the stuff. And so anyway, enjoy this episode, and if you haven't yet, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I'd love to have you. I see a bunch of returning monthly viewers, but you may not be subscribed and just be seeing my stuff coming up in your feed, so you go and you click on it and you watch it. But the best way to support the channel is to subscribe, because I'd love to see you. So anyway, that's it. Okay, love you, bye. Enjoy the video. Okay, bye. It's the middle of the Great Depression. You're in a rural farmhouse kitchen, the air smells like biscuits, and there's a 100-pound sack of flour sitting in the corner. Not just full of flour, but full of potential. Because the woman who bought it isn't just thinking about baking, she's thinking about sewing. She's thinking about how, with a few more sacks like that one, she could make her daughter a new dress, or maybe curtains, or maybe both. This wasn't some niche lifestyle movement. This was survival with a side of style. In the 1930s and 40s, families across America, especially in rural communities, began turning flour sacks and feed sacks into clothing, home decor, and quilts. Not because it was trendy, because it was necessary. Fabric was expensive, jobs were scarce, and feed sacks, well, every family already had them. As long as you had a sewing machine or knew someone who did, you had the raw materials to clothe your family. What started as a desperate workaround turned into one of the most creative, resourceful, and oddly fashionable moments in American history. Before the printed paisleys and pastel plaids, sacks were nothing special. In the 1800s, staples like flour, sugar, and feed came in wooden barrels. They were heavy, expensive to ship, and a nightmare to store. So by the early 1900s, manufacturers made the switch to cloth, tightly woven cotton or muslin sacks that were cheap, reusable, and much easier to haul. Each one was stamped with the company's name, logo, and sometimes the weight of the contents, usually in stubborn ink that wouldn't wash out without a fight. But poor families, especially in farming towns, weren't thinking about branding. They were thinking about how to reuse the fabric. Women started cutting the sacks up into diapers, towels, cleaning rags, and the occasional emergency apron. Then came the clothing. Underwear, children's play clothes, a simple dress. It wasn't glamorous, but it was functional. And when the alternative was going without, a flour sack dress didn't sound half bad. Still, there was a stigma. Everyone could recognize that rough, off-white cloth with the brand name peeking through. Children were teased for wearing chicken feed clothes. Mothers boiled, scrubbed, and bleached the ink out as best they could. But even then, it wasn't about shame, it was about doing what you had to do. It was poverty, yes, but it was also pride and ingenuity. Here's where things get interesting. Companies started noticing what was happening. Feed mills and flour brands realized their packaging wasn't being tossed, it was being worn. And instead of trying to stop it, they leaned in. Sack manufacturers began printing their logos in washable ink. Then they took it a step further. They started producing sacks with colorful prints, florals, stripes, novelty patterns, designed specifically for reuse as fabric. Companies like Bemis Brothers Bag Company and Southern States became unlikely fashion influencers. They ran ads in women's magazines like Progressive Farmer and Ladies' Home Journal, proudly showcasing women wearing dresses made from their feed sacks. And it worked. Suddenly, a trip to the general store became a fashion decision. Families would stand in front of piles of feed bags, comparing patterns before deciding which brand of flour to bring home. Mothers sent their husbands with instructions. Don't forget, we need 2 of the blue rose print. And heaven help the man who came back with mismatched sacks. Companies got competitive. Some brands released limited edition print series, encouraging customers to collect the whole set. Others started offering dress patterns by mail that matched their feed sack prints. One mill even included a dressmaking pattern inside the sack, printed directly onto the fabric. It was packaging turned product, marketing turned mission, poverty turned into pride. By the mid-1930s and into the 1940s, feed sack fashion exploded. This wasn't just rural thrift, it became a full-blown culture. Entire wardrobes were made from feed sacks. Mothers sewed matching dresses for daughters, little boys wore feed sack overalls, and families had feed sack curtains in the kitchen. Feed sack tablecloths on the table and feed sack quilt on the beds. At school, kids compared their outfits. Some even traded sack pieces with friends like basketball cards. In towns across the country, county fairs began hosting feed sack fashion contests. Women would compete to see who could make the most elegant dress out of what was once a bag of grain. Local papers ran photos of winners holding ribbons next to their chickens. There are newspaper records of women sewing their wedding dresses out of feed sacks, not because it was cute or ironic, but because it was what they had, and they made it beautiful. Some used bleach to remove the print completely, then dyed the fabric to match their bouquet. The culture was so widespread that sewing pattern companies like Simplicity and McCall's began including notes like requires 3 feed sacks on their packaging. Even the U.S. Department of Agriculture got involved, publishing sewing guides that specifically encouraged women to repurpose sacks. What had started as depression had become its own economy, a fashion movement made out of what most people would throw away. But the story isn't just about fashion. It's about people, communities, and connection. Sewing was already part of a daily life for many rural women, but feed sack fashion supercharged it. Women organized sewing circles, swapped sacks to collect enough matching fabric for a full garment. One woman might trade 3 yellow florals for 2 of the pink plaid she needed to finish a dress. And this wasn't limited to the farm. Even in small towns, local clubs and church groups met weekly to sew, share patterns, and help one another. Other women passed down skills to daughters and neighbors. Young girls learned to sew their first dresses with feed sacks from the family pantry. In many homes, sewing wasn't just a skill, it was a survival strategy, a creative outlet, a quiet act of love. But these weren't slapdash, stitched together garments. The craftsmanship was impressive. Women added lace trim, embroidered borders, and decorative buttons, even if they had to pull them off old coats or find them at swap meets. In some areas, families made quilts entirely from feed sacks, each square representing a bag of flour, a season of harvest, or a childhood memory. These weren't just clothes, they were stories sewn into every seam. Then came World War II, and with it, fabric rationing. Suddenly, feed sack fashion wasn't just clever, it was patriotic. The U.S. government launched campaigns urging citizens to make do and mend. The USDA and Home Extension Services released pamphlets like How to Make Children's Clothing from Cotton Bags. Women were encouraged to reuse everything: curtains, tablecloths, and yes, feed sacks. It was thrift in the name of national strength. Manufacturers responded by increasing their output of patterned sacks, knowing full well that they were no longer just packaging, they were primary textile sources. Even fashion magazines like Good Housekeeping published articles about stylish sack-based designs. Patterns became more sophisticated with tutorials on pleating, darting, and finishing techniques that rivaled ready-to-wear store options. By 1943, feed sack fashion was mainstream. Entire families attended church in sack clothes. Nobody batted an eye. The stigma was gone. In its place, admiration. Because turning a bag of cornmeal into a Sunday dress wasn't just resourceful anymore, it was patriotic, practical, and damn near heroic. This wasn't just a small town trend, it was a massive, quiet revolution in how rural Americans got dressed. And when you start looking at the numbers, the scale of it is kind of staggering. By the early 1940s, estimates suggest that 3.5 million women and children in the U.S. were regularly wearing clothing made from feed sacks or flour sacks. That's not just a fashion moment. That's a parallel textile industry hiding in plain sight. At its peak, manufacturers were producing more than 1.3 billion yards of feed sack cloth per year. To put that into perspective, that's enough fabric to wrap around the earth over 30 times if you wanted to. But instead of circling the globe, that cloth circled dinner tables, schoolhouses, and sewing circles across America. Some sacks came in standard sizes, 50, 80, or 100 pounds. And it usually took 2 or 3 matching sacks to make an adult dress. That's why women would check the pattern codes printed along the selvage, looking for matches. Some sacks even came with perforated edges or pre-measured templates for cutting into sleeves or aprons. It got so organized that dressmaking pattern companies like Simplicity, McCall's, and Buttericks started publishing guides that included feed sack layouts. Labels on patterns might say things like requires 3 feed sacks, size 100 pounds, for full skirt. It wasn't a hack, it was the standard. And feed stores adapted too. Shopkeepers started displaying the prettiest sacks front and center. Some even hung swatches on clotheslines across the ceiling, so women could see the prints as they walked in. One particularly fun example, There are reports of farm supply stores keeping print books behind the counter, binders where women could browse available sack designs by manufacturer. It was the rural equivalent of a fabric catalog, except the purchase came with 50 pounds of chicken feed. This was mainstream, not marginal. For a time, printed feed sack cloth was one of the largest sources of fabric in the country, behind only commercial textile mills. It wasn't just recycling, it was replacement, full-on clothing production happening right out of the kitchen pantry. Like all good things, feed sack fashion eventually started to fade. The shift began after World War II. With rationing over and the economy booming, ready-made clothing became more accessible. Factories were producing everything from jeans to formal wear, and department stores exploded across the country. For the first time in decades, many families could afford to buy clothes off the rack rather than sew every stitch by hand. At the same time, packaging trends changed. Mills and manufacturers, always looking to cut costs, began switching from cotton to paper and plastic sack, cheaper to produce and easier to print out in bulk. As early as the mid-1950s, cotton sacks began disappearing from feed stores, and by the 1960s, most brands had phased them out entirely. It wasn't a sudden collapse. Feed sack sewing quietly receded. Some families still saved and reused sacks well into the 1970s, but it was no longer a culture-wide practice. And yet, the legacy never truly vanished. Today, vintage feed sack fabric is highly collectible, especially among quilters and textile historians. Entire online communities are dedicated to identifying original sack prints, trading samples, and preserving heirloom quilts stitched from the colorful cottons of the 30s and 40s. Quilt guilds host themed challenges where members use only feed sack cloth, sometimes combining old pieces with modern fabrics to create integral designs. Museums across the country, including the Smithsonian, the Kansas Historical Society, and dozens of local heritage centers, feature feed sack dresses, aprons, and quilts in their Americana exhibitions. There's even an official feed sack club in some regions, where members share stories, catalog historical prints, and help preserve the sewing patterns that were once passed down on crinkled, hand-drawn templates. The cloth may have faded, but the memory hasn't. In many families, those old sack garments became keepsakes, not because they were trendy, but because they represented resilience, thrift, and creativity during one of the hardest eras in American life. And that's what makes it worth remembering. The story of feed sack fashion isn't just about fabric, it's about the human instinct to create, to adapt, to dignify hardship, and to find beauty in scarcity. It's the story of mothers turning packaging into pride, of daughters learning to sew, of husbands who went out for chicken feed and came home with the wrong print. It's also a reminder that sustainable fashion isn't new. The most resourceful generation in modern American history was sewing runway-ready dresses out of flour bags while raising 6 kids on a dusty farm. So the next time you see a vintage feed sack quilt or a little label at a museum exhibit, don't just smile at the charm, recognize the legacy. This wasn't just craft, it was culture. And it proves, more than anything else, that sometimes the bag is the outfit. Great. Now I'm going to go check and see if my great-grandma's quilt that she made is made out of feed sack patterns. So that's cool. And if it is, double awesome. Hey.